Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. Thank you for your patience while I've tried to get this video done for almost the last week. So I hope that everybody's feeling good as we move in to our literature unit. I know you did some reading for it last week, but I also feel like everybody was still super tense about the social science project. So I hope now we can take a deep breath and roll on in to those projects. I'm sorry, to those readings, pardon me. Still working on social science projects, as you have no doubt noticed. It's going to be a few more days before I have them all returned. I don't have one overarching issue with them at this point. Everything is kind of different for everybody. If I find that trend changes, I'll definitely address it in our next video. So, welcome to the humanities. Welcome to literature. So, as we talked before, we've talked about the sciences, we've talked about the social sciences, and now we're into the humanities. Much like with the sciences and social sciences, there are some subjects that have some overlap between the two. Like sometimes people consider history a social science, sometimes they consider it one of the humanities, sometimes religion is considered a social science, sometimes it's considered in the humanities because it does deal with how people behave, and it has some things to do with social structures and interactions. But for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on literature. As I mentioned before, those of you who go on to take a 200 level English, the skills that we use and develop in this unit will be helpful for you. And even if you're not planning to go on to a 200 level English, the analytical skills, practicing with MLA and quoting and source material, the critical thinking skills we'll be building in this unit will still be incredibly helpful to you. So, last week, you were asked to read Revelation and Everything That Rises Must Converge, and then I found out this week that Everything That Rises is not in our edition of They Say, I Say. So for those of you who hunted it down, thank you for going the extra mile, and I apologize for this error. On this week's quiz, there is a question about it. You can leave it blank if you are not one of the people who hunted down the story on the internet. I'm manually grading those, so I know to give you full credit for the question that refers to the reading that I did not give you, so my apologies. So those two short stories are from Flannery O'Connor, a Southern writer who was writing in the 1950s and early 1960s. You will note that her writings deal with issues of race, class, and religion in the South. Keep in mind that she's writing in the segregated South. We are at the beginnings of the civil rights movement when she is writing these stories. They were set during her time. So keep that in mind. You'll see language there that we do not use now. You will often see the ugly side of humanity. Flannery O'Connor did not shy away from that. She is known as a Southern Gothic writer, and some call her, some of her stories grotesque. I will admit that I absolutely adore many of her stories. She has a way of leading the reader in on a path and then pulling the rug out from underneath them. So in many cases, we'll be presented with a narrator, or not a narrator, a main character that we are led to judge and judge severely. And then often by the end of the story, we find ourselves having to look at how we feel and how we think about things. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll talk a bit more about Revelation and literary works in the next videos. You also had some poems. I know that poetry tends to unnerve some students. Some students love it, and some students are like, ugh, I don't do poetry. And I think that stems from the fact that people feel like it's hard to understand in some cases. And I've given you a broad variety. We have Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. We have The Emperor of Ice Cream by Wallace Stevens. And we have The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. So dates-wise, Dickinson was writing in the 1800s. Eliot was, I believe, Love Song was written in the teens or early 20s. I need to look back at that. I'm a little bit rusty on my modernist poetry. And then Wallace Stevens would follow later. These are all interesting authors and all interesting for very different reasons. We'll do a little more close talk about them in the next video. But I don't want you to be intimidated by poetry. And I don't want you to be intimidated by any literature. Please approach the piece of writing and read it, give it a try. Note things that you don't understand. Note areas that you have questions about. Note things that you like or sound cool. The first time that I read Emperor of Ice Cream by Wallace Stevens, I was 16 years old. I was at governor's school in a poetry class, and I had never read anything like this before. And I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I loved the language, and I loved the rhythm of the poem. And I loved it so much that I actually memorized it. That's what I call my pocket poem. There's a Poetry Day, National Poetry Day in April, and the Poetry Foundation says, have a poem in your pocket, and what they mean is have a poem that you've memorized that you can pull out and kind of always have with you, and that one is my poem in the pocket. So it deals with, the fleeting nature of life, and we'll do a little close reading later, but I want you to read these, think about them, and note what it is that gets your attention, what it is that you like, what is it that's confusing if something is. Once you've done that, then go and look at maybe some context about these readings. Think about what when the writer was writing. What is the writer potentially responding to? What is it that is giving rise to this poem? Sometimes we can see that through historical events. Sometimes we can see that through social trends. Sometimes we don't. We don't know. But it can be a useful practice to go do that. I like to do it second so that I am not, I like to approach something kind of fresh the first time without a whole lot of ideas about it. And then I like to go do that research and then come back and do a second reading. When you take a literature class, there will usually be some front matter about the author and about the time in which they're writing, and that can be really helpful to read before your first reading. But for the purposes of this class, I'm fine with you just coming to it fresh. So then, let's see. I talked a little bit about Stevens. Emily Dickinson, always a favorite. Because I Could Not Stop for Death is the most straightforward out of the poems that we have in our little poetry unit. Emily Dickinson is a really interesting writer. People have often assumed that she was depressed, incredibly reclusive. We're learning more and more about her still now through writings of hers, of those who corresponded with her. And one of my favorite things about Dickinson is that she approaches deep, dark, difficult topics like death, and does so with a sense of humor and kind of a lightness and a curiosity. And that's one of the reasons that I really love her and bring this poem. First of all, it's kind of, I would say it's the easiest of the three to understand. The language, despite it being the oldest, I think the language is the closest to what we would use now. And it's another short read that you can really get a lot out of. So this week, we have Everyday Use and the Things They Carried. These are two short stories that are absolutely loaded with symbolism and have characters that you can kind of go in depth with. Everyday Use, I believe, was written in the 1970s, if I recall correctly. The Things They Carried was written later, but is set during the Vietnam War. And it was written by a Vietnam veteran, Tim O'Brien, and one of the characters in the story is kind of based on his experience, but don't assume that this is his firsthand experience. One of the things to keep in mind when you're looking at a piece of literature, there's a narrator. The narrator and the author are not necessarily the same person. If you're working with something like confessional poetry, where Sylvia Plath is saying I, she does mean I. But in a story, in a poem, we have a narrator who is not necessarily that author. To give you an example, Edgar Allan Poe, in his story, The Telltale Heart, Edgar Allan Poe is not writing about his own personal experience. He's created a character to narrate that story. If you are a fan of old country and western music, Johnny Cash, in Folsom Prison Blues, he says, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." Johnny Cash didn't shoot anybody. This is a character in a song saying that. So the narrator and the author, not the same person. We'll talk a little bit more, and by we I mean me, because I'm the one doing all the talking here, right, about these pieces in another video, because this one's going to be long and I don't want to overload you. The next thing I want to bring up, I want you to think about themes of what you're reading. Now, when we talk about the theme of a work of literature, a theme should be a complete statement. I'm seeing a lot of talk about themes in journal entries and in your checkpoints that just list an abstract noun like love or death or sadness. A theme should be a complete statement. Love is not a theme. Love will ruin your life. That is a theme. I'm not saying that is true. I'm saying that could be a theme of a piece of literature. None that we have. But anyway, not this time. So when you're thinking about a theme, that abstract noun that you've picked out, what is this piece of literature, or what is that author saying about that? So think about it that way. So, also, last week and the week before, I introduced you to some theoretical lenses. Now, these theoretical lenses are angles to take when looking at a piece of literature. When we say a lens, like you're looking at it in a certain way. So, the Purdue Online Writing Lab, I think, provides a really good overview of these. Don't drive yourself crazy. Often students overthink them and get kind of anxious about using these critical lenses. They are ways to look at a piece of literature. So for instance, if you used a class or Marxist perspective to look at Revelation by Flannery O'Connor, you would pay attention to how she views class and how the social structure the main character views class, and how the social structure that Ms. Turpin has existed in has affected her viewpoints. If you looked at it from a critical race theory perspective, you would be looking at how race plays a part in this work, what this work says about the structures involving that. If you wanted to look at it from a historicist perspective, you would look at how historical events are shaping and coming through in the work. So when you use these perspectives, it's not asking you to mold your belief system to a particular perspective. It's asking you to step outside yourself and look at the piece of work from that angle. So that's something I want you to practice. Pick an angle and look at one of these pieces of work and see what you can find. There are feminist readings of Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. There are feminist readings of everyday use. You can apply many of these lenses to many different pieces of literature. In that vein, also keep in mind a work of literature can have more than one theme. Two of you can choose to talk about the same work of literature and have a different theme, and you're not wrong. Okay, so if you see something there, if there's something you're interested in and something you want to work with, but you're not quite sure how to approach it, let's talk about it. So the literature essay is your next piece of writing, and I think you all are going to find this about 5 times easier than the social science project. It's going to be quicker. It's going to be more straightforward, I think, for a lot of you. So the literature essay assignment asks you to use one of the pieces of literature we're working with. That's the stories, poems, or the play. There's going to be a play for you to read next week. I'll have that deployed later today. It's very short. It's a one-act play, very short. It asks you to choose one of these readings, identify a theme, and discuss how the writer uses a literary device to deliver that theme. Remember that literary devices are, or writing, a writing strategy, structure, tone, style, characters. Yes, I'm using a list and cheating. Symbolism, allegory, point of view, setting, all kinds of things. So let's say that, you choose a poem that you like the language in. Think about what the author is doing with that language. How is that language helping the writer to get the idea across? That's just one example. You will use evidence from your primary source. Your primary source is the actual text by that author. If you want to do outside research and bring in perspectives from literary criticism, you absolutely can. Keep in mind when we say literary criticism, we're not thinking about criticism in the traditional sense of, that is bad, but more a critique, an analysis, someone talking about it. So when I say, literary criticism, a lot of times people think that's going to be something negative, like they're looking at bad reviews of the story. That's not what I mean. It's where people have had an academic conversation about this piece of literature. And now you are entering this academic conversation about the piece of literature. So I hope that this video has answered more questions than it's raised. As always, if you have questions, please let me know. I've really enjoyed emailing and speaking with some of you in the last week. As you're thinking about this literature essay, if you're feeling lost or if you have an idea but you don't know where to go with it, please get in touch. The Writing and Reading Center is also a great resource. If you're having trouble finding sources in the databases, you can absolutely get in touch with our course librarian. And I hope you all are having a wonderful week and you have a great weekend and that this lovely November is treating you well. Take care, and I will be back with another video to talk specifically about our literary works. If you have questions or things you want me to talk about in that video, please email me or drop it in your checkpoint.